Imagine a company. This company has a lot of expenses. But what if you could remove those expenses and give the money saved to the shareholders as profit? Imagine you could be one of these shareholders, and you could trade your shares with anyone as easy as sending email, but without any middlemen, brokers, or commissions. Well, now you can with BitShares. BitShares are shares of digital companies that are traded directly from person to person over the internet. Digital companies exist entirely in software that runs on the computers of the customers that use them. Bitcoin was the first digital company that calls its shares coins and promoted their use as a form of money. BitShares goes beyond Bitcoin to offer many new and more profitable companies in industries like banking, stock exchanges, auctions, music, voting, lotteries, insurance, and many more. BitShares does for business what Bitcoin is doing for money. To learn more, explore BitShares.org.
All right, well, that's a summary of what we're doing. I'm going to explain today how I got to the concept of BitShares and a new way of explaining Bitcoin. I've been in the Bitcoin space since very early on, when you could still mine it with your CPU. But unfortunately, I didn't see any way to make money in it, and I had to put food on the table. So I ignored it for several years until Mt. Gox. Can we go to the next slide here? Is there a clicker over here? All right. So about a year ago, Mt. Gox had their funds seized by the United States government. And that's when I realized, oh gosh, we need a decentralized exchange. So I set out to build one of these exchanges, and no one really knew what exactly that meant. So I finally came up with something in June of last year, but I ran into a lot of problems. How in the world am I going to explain my exchange to people? Because it's even more complicated than Bitcoin. So how many of you ever try to explain Bitcoin to someone, right? It usually goes something like, it's the first decentralized digital currency. You can trade it from person to person over the internet, and anyone can mine it with their own computers. And if people don't just nod their head and pretend to understand you, they'll usually throw up a bunch of objections. They're like, it's a Ponzi scheme. It's got no intrinsic value. Or it's a deflationary currency. People are going to hoard it. Or other people say, it's just thin air. It's worthless. And the interesting thing is that you get those arguments from all across the spectrum. Whether you're an Austrian economist or a Keynesian, people that should be our allies are completely against Bitcoin. And the reason for that is that monetary theory and policy is sort of like a religion. No one really understands what money is. We can't agree on what makes the best money, what properties money should have. So if you try to introduce Bitcoin to someone as money, you got all these roadblocks. It's almost insurmountable before you even get to the technology. So have you ever stopped to think about why we don't understand money? Henry Ford once said, it's well enough that people in the nation do not understand our banking system and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. This misunderstanding of money is very intentional in our society. We have our educational institutions, our media, our government, trying to confuse the issue of money because money is the basis of their power. So if we want to explain Bitcoin to people, we have to break through all this propaganda, all these misunderstandings. And I believe that is a very difficult job, and people have been trying to do it for 100 years. And until Ron Paul, it was getting almost nowhere. So last September, I was trying to explain my decentralized exchange to my father. And that's where the idea of a decentralized autonomous corporation, or company, as I call it now, first came into being. What I did is I said, all right, let's pretend that these aren't coins. They're shares in a company. And this company is earning profits or revenues from transaction fees, and it can pay that revenue to the shareholders as profits. And if you have a company as the basis, there's many different business models that you can implement. And my exchange works just like a bank. A bank is just a company, and it can create dollars out of thin air. If a bank can create dollars, why can't I? So, how does a bank create dollars? It takes your collateral, whether it's a house or your gold, and it will issue you banknotes based on that collateral. Generally, the collateral has to be more than the value of the dollars it's issuing. And if the value of the collateral falls, they foreclose. They take it back, they sell it, and they buy back the banknotes. That's how banks work, and that's something a blockchain can do. So, recognizing that if the only thing you do is replace the collateral of a house with collateral of shares in the bank, I mean, go to Bank of America, say, I'd like to borrow $100,000. I've got $200,000 worth of your stock. Will you lend it to me? They'll say, sure. Well, they might not. It's kind of a special product there. But in theory, there's no reason why they couldn't do that, especially because shares in a company are far more liquid than your house. You don't have mismatch in maturity dates. So if the price starts to fall, you can sell it and you can cover the position. The bank is far more solvent than traditional banks. In my exchange, I set it up to be at least 200% reserve. So that's sort of a breakthrough, because now I have a way of explaining Bitcoin and all these other systems as well as analyzing them. But I want to make something very clear first. It's a different money is what something is used for. It's not what something is. Gold does not cease to be a metal just because you call it money or you use it in exchange. Banknotes don't cease to be bearer bonds just because they're defined as legal tender. And Bitcoin does not cease to be a bearer share in a company called Bitcoin just because people are promoting their use as money. And in fact, bearer shares are used by the rich all over to move wealth between each other in a compact form. So this is a common thing that's existed. Bitcoin just put these concepts on a decentralized ledger and provided transparency and integrity to an otherwise closed and system. So what does this get us? This is my friend Dave. I used to work with Dave, and we would talk about Bitcoin for hours around the water cooler and get paid for talking about Bitcoin. Dave was a great guy, but he had different theories of how money should work. He didn't think that Bitcoin was sustainable, that it could work as money because, well, it's deflationary, even though it's inflationary. That the mining is unsustainable, and that he's always had some fear that there's going to be some kind of discontinuity in the future because of the Bitcoin structure. So I ran into him a couple weeks ago, and when I last saw him, I tried to explain what I was leaving my job to go do and build this decentralized bank, and he didn't understand it. He's like, I don't get what you're doing. So I said, well, let me give you the new pitch. What we're doing is we take business plans. If you're going to start a company in the free market, you issue shares, and you just allocate them among your friends. You need some way to track it. So we do that. We issue shares, and then we encode the business model in software that runs on everyone's computer. These businesses are designed to generate revenue from transaction fees, and we have to minimize expenses so that we can have the most profit. There can be many different types of businesses that we can implement, whether it's a bank, an insurance company, a lottery system, or you can use it for money, insurance, music. There's so many different things. There's about 12 different industries we've identified, and there's probably many more. I explained all this to him, and he says, I finally get it. I understand what you're doing. He says, but you've got a problem. If you're buying back shares, it's going to be even more deflationary than Bitcoin. And I had to interrupt him. I said, wait a second. These are shares in companies. You want to increase the equity per share. And he said, oh, you're right. Because you know what? People actually understand shares, companies. They understand what gives them value. They understand that you want dividends, that you want stock buybacks. Ask any Apple shareholder. That's how you create value. And if you're creating value, earning a profit, providing a service, that's something that people can understand. And then if you say, well, these happen to be extremely fungible and divisible, so you could also use them for money. Well, which would you rather use for money? Shares in a company that's losing $1 billion a year, or shares in a company that's earning a profit? But not everyone. I really like David. He's a great guy, and we talk frequently. Yeah, we have a little bit of disagreement because not everyone likes to call them shares. Preferring instead to call them decentralized applications, distributed applications. And this is a quote he said in a paper he's published, that Bitcoin doesn't have a board of directors, shares, or any of the other characteristics of a company. And I'd like to address some of that. But first thing I would say, one doesn't simply convince the regulators that it's a currency by calling them coins or tokens. That does not change what they are. You don't go up to a regulator and say, these are not the decentralized autonomous companies you are looking for. They're going to make their own opinion like the IRS recently did, and they declared Bitcoin property to be treated in the same way that stocks are treated. So yes, there are regulations that do apply to shares and to companies and to bearer shares or whatever you want to call it, but we don't get to pick what regulations. The regulators get to apply whichever regulations they believe give them the most power and control in the economy. So let's talk about Bitcoin for a second here. And what can we learn about Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a company where the coins are shares. It earns revenue from the transaction fees, has employees or subcontractors, the miners. It has to pay these employees, and how does it pay them? It pays them by issuing new shares. Well, if this is a regular company and you issue new shares to pay your employees, that goes as a cost on your balance sheet. So you look at Bitcoin's revenue and its expenses, and at the end of the year, depending on its market cap, Bitcoin's losses are $500 million to $1 billion a year. Not only that, but normally shareholders have some say. But Bitcoin holders, Bitcoin has two classes of stock. You've got the capital shares and the voting shares. What about a board of directors? The voting shares all pool their votes into these mining pools. The mining pool operators are effectively a board of directors that get to decide which transactions make it into the blockchain. So if Bitcoin's a company, it's making a loss. We want to fix that. Because if we can fix that, then we can actually be more efficient. So we have to make Bitcoin profitable. And everything we do needs to be profitable or it's not sustainable. One of the ways I like to demonstrate this point is Bitcoin's security comes from being more economic difficulty in securing the network, or how hard it is to produce the blocks. So if you want to have some amount of security, it all depends on how much you're paying for security. Anyone can attack the network that's willing to pay more. Well, if you had to move the burden, remove the subsidy, the transaction fees would have to cover it entirely. So what would the transaction fees be if we removed the subsidy and wanted to maintain the same level of security we have today? It'd be around $3 a transaction. And if Bitcoin grew to be 100 times bigger than it is today, you'd probably need 100 times more security. For the same transaction volume of a megabyte per block, you'd be looking at $300 a transaction, unless you increase the number of transactions you supported dramatically. But it'd be much better if you could take all that money that's being spent on electricity and give it as profit to the shareholders. So we all know what happens if you don't make a profit. You go bankrupt, and the result is misery. So what we're doing with BitShares is we're replacing the miners, and we're giving control back to the shareholders. The shareholders being the people that own the currency. And this is a concept that's known as proof of stake, although most proof of stake systems are hybrid if you're a pure coin user. It's got some proof of work mixed in with it. And they also require you to have your wallet online, exposing your private keys. And only a small percentage of the shareholders actually participate in this process. So I'd like to introduce a new definition of decentralization. I say you're decentralized when your power or influence over the network is directly proportional to how many shares you have, and when you have 100% participation of the shareholders. So let's give power back to the shareholders. But it's not arbitrary power. These decentralized autonomous companies have all of their rules and procedures encoded in the blockchain that can't be changed. The only power they have is to include or not include transactions. And if you replace the board of directors of Bitcoin, the mining pool operators, with delegates, so that people who are shareholders can appoint 100 different people to take turns producing blocks, each of which can be fired within 24 hours if they don't produce blocks with transactions or if they start showing some kind of discrimination. You end up with a system that can be as fast as Ripple while being extremely profitable. So there are unlimited opportunities in this space. I gave you an example that we can implement the business model of a bank. We can also do domain names. We can eliminate domain name squatting by fixing the economics of the system. And you do that by eliminating the price fixing and auctioning off the names where the proceeds go to the shareholders. You can do charities, smart contracts, insurance, voting, gaming, lending. Ripple is an example of a DAC that does lending. It tracks the debts in the system, and it actually pays you dividends because they destroy their transaction fees. I use dividends loosely. So there are all these possibilities, and everyone here is trying to do some variation on a DAC, whether it's Bitcoin for money or some other system. And my message to you today is you need to focus on how to make your DAC profitable and how you can migrate your shares in your coins from something that's being debased to pay for miners to a more secure, faster system that's actually profitable. And you'll get far better results in the marketplace. So I had to go through all these different ones relatively quickly. The last thing I want to end on is the Bitcoin space is kind of like the .com era. Early on, there were all kinds of websites and companies that had massive valuations. But a lot of them had one thing in common. They didn't make a profit. It took a long time, and then eventually all those ones that weren't making a profit went bust. And so Bitcoin's in the same space today. We've got to figure out how to make cryptocurrency profitable aside from mere speculation and network effect. And so I encourage you to go forth and do so. Thank you.
Way to go.